Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Please give me a quick sound check as we come into the stream, and please do hit that like button. That helps boost the algorithm and helps get this stream out for more viewers to watch. And we have a very special guest today. We're not going to waste any time because his time is precious. For the first time long overdue to this program, we have Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, Professor of English Literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran, and advisor. He has been an advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiations team, and he is here to discuss everything Iran, everything axis of resistance. Professor Marandi, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, yes. So we have a lot to talk about. So how about we get started? So, Professor Marandi, I wanted your assessment of the situation in Gaza, but I wanted to talk about maybe to begin the role of Iran. So I've been reading Western mainstream media of late. A recent article in Foreign Affairs really spoke disparagingly about Iran's role in West Asia in solidarity with Gaza. There have been talks about Iranian people not so much excited about Iran's strong position in favor of Gaza, in support of Gaza, against Israel's ongoing genocidal assault. So, given that you are in Tehran, you've talked about this a lot on other programs. Could you talk about Iran's role in the resistance to Israel and in its solidarity with the Palestinian people in Gaza and beyond?
Sure. Well, I think I'd have to point out that the hostility towards Iran and its support for the resistance is nothing new. And this is not only something that comes from Western sources, but it also comes from Arab sources in the Persian Gulf region, these oil-rich family dictatorships that fund a lot of think tanks in the West that have a great deal of influence in the media across Europe and North America. They have the same sort of narrative, and there's a reason for that. They do nothing for the Palestinians, and they have been, in the eyes of many, betraying the Palestinian cause for a very long time. And so when Iran supports the Palestinian cause, they have to find a way to discredit Iran. And so that narrative is understandable. In the West, the same is true. They want to believe, they want to project the notion that Iranians don't support the Islamic Republic. The regime, as they like to call it, is unpopular. It is despised, it is hated, it is corrupt, and people want to overthrow the regime, as they call it. And that is an understandable position for the West to take as well. In fact, when President Raisi was killed in the helicopter crash, immediately afterwards, there was a lot of talk in the Western media about how Iranians were celebrating and how they were all happy to see him die. And I had a personal experience on the BBC, literally an hour or two after it was stated that he had passed away. I was on the BBC television, and before me, they had these two Iranian American women or Canadian women, and they were saying how everyone is celebrating and how everyone is happy, and people online are celebrating. And after spending maybe 10, 15 minutes speaking with these two people, the journalist finally got to me, the person who's actually living in Iran. And I said, from what I've seen on the streets, in conversations on campus, people are very unhappy. They're very sad. And they were very worried until, because it was a few hours before it became clear that the president had indeed passed away. But then I told him that I'm you're going to see funerals in the coming days, and I expect them to be enormous. And when people come to the streets in their millions, what are you going to say about all this narrative building that we've been witnessing and that we are witnessing? And so 3 days later, I think it was 3 days later, on the same show, because it was the same hour, I was again invited on the BBC, and I told them that I told the host that, 3 days earlier, this is what happened, what I was saying, and look, people on the streets, millions of people in Tehran, millions of people in other cities. Does this look like a country that is celebrating the death of their president? And the problem, therefore, is, and the Western media has gone silent ever since. They shut down the narrative and moved on to the next topic. But the problem that the West has is that they want to believe these things because they want to believe that their adversaries are unpopular, that they're hated, and that the world wants to be like the West. But that isn't necessarily the case. In fact, it definitely isn't true. So this is nothing new. I've been hearing this for decades. In Iran, the Palestinian people have an enormous amount of sympathy. And I think the funerals themselves are reflective of that, because President Raisi was a very, very staunch supporter of the Palestinian cause. And so, or when General Soleimani was murdered by Trump 4 years ago, we also saw many millions of people come to the streets. And again, he represented Iran's policy towards the apartheid regime. So again, this is nothing new. This has been going on for decades. And I don't expect things to change in the West unless there's some major shift in the political equation in the West or across the world. But Iranians have supported the Palestinian cause from the beginning of the revolution. Those who led the revolution, especially they spoke about the Palestinian cause alongside the cause of the South African people struggling against apartheid. After the revolution, Iran immediately broke off ties with South Africa and the Israeli regime, and they began to fund the resistance. Back then, of course, it was led by Yasser Arafat, and in South Africa by the main group was the ANC and Nelson Mandela. So Iran funded the political wing and the military wing in South Africa of the ANC and other groups, and they did the same for the Palestinian people. And the reason why Iran is so antagonized, the reason why Iran is so has been sanctioned the way it has, is because of its support for the Palestinian people. It really has nothing to do with Iran's peaceful nuclear program or terrorism or anything else. It's really about Iran's foreign policy.
Yeah, and you had an encounter on Piers Morgan where you were confronted with this very phenomenon that you speak of. And I was wondering if you could then talk about, because of course there's a lot of this projection, there's a lot of this demonization of Iran because it does not behave like the West, because it does not follow the West's diktats, and I think the sanctions and all of the targeting of Iran for literal war from the United States and, of course, all of its vassals is proof of this. But could you talk about then, because you said after the revolution, Iran began to support the Palestinian resistance. And I always think to myself, well, similar to other countries that are truly sovereign, if you are actually supporting the right of Palestinian self-determination in a very material way, in a very concrete way, then protest seems to be a very a lower form of support. Could you talk about the concrete ways right now Iran is supporting the Palestinian resistance and how that is affecting the situation in Gaza in this ongoing genocide? But it is a war. I do like to say, even though it's not a war as we may think of it as two militaries facing each other, it is a war in the sense that there's a war of resistance and there's, of course, the genocidal campaign. So could you talk about that?
Yes, sure. And I'd just like to add that it's also a fact that the Iranians were supporting other um, countries that were suffering from US sanctions and dirty wars. So Iran supported Cuba, but I think most importantly, Iran supported Nicaragua during the dirty war in the 1980s when the United States was using the Contra rebels to the right-wing fanatical Contra rebels to undermine the government in Nicaragua. So it's not just South Africa or South African countries and Palestine. It includes places like Nicaragua and Cuba. But the Iranians, I think it would be fair to say that its military involvement or its support for the military wing of the resistance grew gradually. So, for example, in Lebanon, Hezbollah was created during the Israeli invasion of the country. The Israelis captured half of Lebanon, they captured the capital, and they killed anywhere between 30 and 40,000 people. They carried out the massacre in the Palestinian refugee camp Sabra and Shatila. Between 2 to 3,000 people were slaughtered, women and children, in less than 48 hours in that camp by their fascist right-wing allies in Lebanon, but with the support of the Israeli military. It was at that time that Hezbollah was born, and in 1982. And Hezbollah grew during the occupation. And gradually it began to become increasingly powerful, and it forced the Israelis to retreat in phases. And ultimately, in the year 2000, the Israeli regime was forced to retreat from southern Lebanon. So Hezbollah was a national liberation organization, and it was created as a result of Israeli aggression. Also, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, as they grew, because we're speaking about the contemporary situation, they gradually got more support from Iran. And so their capabilities gradually expanded. And what we see today, as you rightly point out, is a war in which the Israelis have failed. So there are two parts to this conflict today. One is the genocide, where the Israeli regime is slaughtering innocent civilians out of revenge because they've lost on the battlefield. And the other is the battlefield, where the Israelis have failed. They have failed to control the northern part of the Gaza Strip. They failed to control the central part of the Gaza Strip, and they failed to control the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And they've also failed in the north against Hezbollah as well. And so the Palestinian capabilities, their military capabilities today, are obviously far greater than they were before. And that is, of course, because of their own innovation, their own courage, but also because of Iranian funding, Iranian support, Iranian technology. And so these tunnels that we see across Gaza and across Lebanon and elsewhere, and in Yemen, these are all with the help, obviously, of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's why, for example, just hours ago, the Americans bombed a radio station in Al Hodeidah in Yemen, killing a large number of innocent civilians. They cannot bomb the underground bases of the Yemeni armed forces, or Ansarullah, what they call the Houthis. So the Americans and the British take their revenge on ordinary people or sympathizers. It's the same policy as the Israeli regime in Gaza or in the West Bank or against the Lebanese. But the capabilities that we see today are bearing fruit. The Israelis have lost on the battlefield. There is no escape from this defeat. The longer the war lasts, the worse it is going to get for the regime. Iran will continue to support Hamas. It will continue to support its allies in defending themselves and the people of Palestine, not just in the Gaza Strip, but elsewhere. And the coalition of resistance organizations, or the axis of resistance, they will continue to increase pressure on the Israeli regime to force it to accept a ceasefire. So you're going to see Yemen continue to block ships, and Yemen will continue to enforce the Genocide Convention as they've stated they would. Hezbollah will continue to hit the Israeli regime hard, and it will hit it harder. And the resistance in Iraq and Syria will continue to lob missiles and drones and cause uh, greater damage to the Israeli regime to help decrease pressure on the resistance. But also, the resistance in Iraq will make sure that the Americans feel vulnerable so that they refrain from taking further steps in supporting, or taking military steps in supporting the genocide.
Indeed, indeed. And I know that it's been a very active time for Iran, of course, with the death of Ibrahim Raisi, the Iranian president. But before this, in April, there was Operation True Promise, which is emblematic of all that you have spoken about. Could you just comment on what was the true impact of that operation? Because even today, there are rumblings in the Western mainstream media talking about this operation as insignificant, as essentially countered. Of course, we know that Iran was trying to prevent a broader war from breaking out, so it was communicating with relevant parties to ensure that there was knowledge, including the United States. But could you talk about the true impact of this operation? Because I think it is often spoken about it and misinterpreted by the collective West, purposefully, in my estimation. But back to you.
Over the years, the Israeli regime targeted Iranians, and it was basically because they were supporting the Syrian armed forces against the extremist groups that were backed by NATO and these oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region and the Israeli regime. So, for example, alongside the occupied Golan, the occupied Syrian Golan, the Israelis were supporting both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda. Both ISIS and Al-Qaeda had bases alongside the Syrian Golan. And of course, ISIS came out of Al-Qaeda. They were one, and then they split. And also, Al-Qaeda, from the very beginning of this dirty war, was working with Americans. We have the famous email that was exposed by WikiLeaks, where Jake Sullivan tells Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. And of course, the same extremist forces were being used in Libya, such as the person who carried out a suicide attack in Manchester. He and his father were working with British intelligence, and they were fighting in Libya. So you have these extremist groups that were working with the West. And so ISIS and Al-Qaeda both had bases alongside the Syrian Golan. And as the Syrian army and their allies would try to defeat them and retake Syrian territory, the Israelis would bomb the Syrians and their allies. They would use helicopter gunships. They would shell them. They would use tank fire. They would treat the terrorists in their hospitals, and they would give them ammunition and food to carry on the fight against the government. And during those years, because Israel wanted to overthrow the Syrian government alongside its partners in NATO and Turkey and Jordan and in the Persian Gulf region, they would target Iranians. But the Iranians did not respond because the Syrian government was in enough trouble as it was, and Iran wanted to keep the focus on Syria. More recently, after October the 7th, when the conflict intensified in Gaza, and Lebanon and Hezbollah joined in the fight to help Gaza, because the Israelis have been forced to keep half of their forces and capabilities in the north, and thus uh, making it much more difficult for them in the fight against Hamas and its allies. The Iranians, of course, were helping the resistance. And so, again, there was a new wave of attacks on Iranian officers. A number of officers were killed. And finally, when the Israeli regime bombed the Iranian consulate, uh, killing a number of officers and a couple of very senior officers, the Iranians decided to respond. I went to the embassy, which I'll get to a bit later. So the Iranians decided to respond because they said that the Israelis have crossed all red lines, and tomorrow they may bomb another embassy or another part of the Iranian embassy in Syria. And this is unprecedented in the world. Never before had an embassy been uh, targeted intentionally, killing so many people before. There was just the case of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, which the Americans claimed that it was an accident, and I think there were 3 Chinese diplomats who were killed. But this was something openly intentional, and the casualties were higher. So in all, I think over the past few months, 19 military officers, including senior officers, were murdered by the Israelis. So after this, the Iranians decided to respond. And they waited a couple of weeks, both because they wanted to carry out psychological warfare, but also there were complicated negotiations going on. Iran wanted to take the issue to the UN Security Council, which they did, and the US, Britain, and France refused to condemn the Israeli regime for bombing the Iranian embassy. And I think that's quite extraordinary. And I think the West really doesn't understand how people across the world and Iranians view the West when they behave in this way. So the Iranians proved to their own people and to the international community, minus the West, but the international community, the global South, the real majority, and increasingly the more powerful part of the international community, they showed them that the true nature of the Israeli regime, and their backers. So ultimately, Iran decided to carry out the attack. Iran announced it beforehand, and there was a reason for that. Iran wanted the United States and its allies, all of them, to combine all of their capabilities. So the Americans brought in everything they had. So did the French, the British, the Israelis, of course. And then the Iranians began launching drones, a significant number of drones, over a bit less than, I think, 200 drones. They were older drones, and they announced it. Basically, they openly declared that they are firing these drones, and the reason was because the Iranians wanted the Israelis and the Americans to engage. For 3 reasons. One is that the Iranians wanted to deplete the Israeli and the American and the European air defense capabilities. According to some estimates, up to $4 billion of missiles were used, and there were roughly $4 billion, $4 million were spent on air defense that night. $1.35 billion by the Israelis, and the rest by mostly the Americans and the other allies. Whereas the Iranians only spent a few, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, or maybe $100,000 or a bit more on the drones. The second reason was that Iran wanted to gather intelligence about capabilities, both Israeli capabilities, but also American and European capabilities. And the third was that these drones were decoys. They were used to keep the air defenses busy so that the missiles could also be fired. So the Iranians fired when the drones reached near their destinations, and the Israelis and the Americans had to down the drones because they all had payloads. So when they were near their destination, meaning Palestine, the Iranians fired a series of missiles. Now, there are 2 broadly speaking, two types of missiles. One was older model missiles. Again, they were kept in storage for many years. Iran wanted to get rid of them, but also they were cheap and they forced the Israelis and the Americans again to engage. So it was very expensive for the West, and it also gave more information about their capabilities. And alongside that, the Iranians fired some of their more advanced drones. Not, sorry, their more advanced missiles, not their most advanced missiles, but more advanced missiles. Those missiles, as far as I know, all got through. I've heard friends say that some got through and a couple didn't, but as far as I know, all got through. That's my understanding. So the Iranians hit a military base in the south, which is probably the most protected military air base in the world, where the F-35s were stored, which is used to bomb both Gaza, but also which was used to attack the Iranian embassy. And they also bombed an intelligence base on the Golan, the Syrian Golan, occupied Golan, and damaged that severely as well. So Iran was sending a message to the Israelis and the Americans that we can get through. We can make things very costly for you. And for us, it's very inexpensive and very much worth carrying out. And so the Iranians also warned the Americans that if the Israeli regime responds, that we will strike back heavily. And Iran was prepared to fire 1,700 roughly drones and missiles in a second wave if Israel attacked Iran in a meaningful way. And if that had happened, they would have gone through because the Americans did the heavy lifting. The Americans and the Israelis did use everything they had. And according to some estimates, they used half of their capabilities. So if Iran had fired a second wave, most of the drones and missiles would have gotten through. And that would have created major devastation across Israel. And that's why the Israeli regime really didn't carry out a counterstrike. There are three small drones that were used. A number of missiles were fired. Only one entered Iranian airspace and did no real damage to Iran's installations. So the Iranians decided not to retaliate, but they were ready. They were waiting for the Israelis to carry out an attack to carry out this major second wave of drone and missile strikes. So, and the fact that the Israelis did not respond in any meaningful way against the Iranians, I think itself indicates that the Israelis and the Americans understood that this was not a war that they could win.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, that is just not the analysis, the reporting that you get here in the collective West about this. But I think everything that you said in terms of the behavior of both Israel, the United States, and of course those who participated in trying to stymie and thwart Iran's Operation True Promise really does tell the true tale. So I wanted to cover two more topics with you, Professor Marandi. And the first is you mentioned earlier the um, Israel being defeated on the battlefield, that it is actually operating as a defeated force in Gaza in particular. Given all that's happening in Rafah right now with this horrific slaughter, but at the same time, as we're seeing that, we also, if we follow any other reports from maybe more credible sources like Al Mayadeen, that follows the resistance pretty closely, we hear also that the fighting is very fierce, not just in Rafah, but all across the Gaza Strip. So, could you talk about how the resistance has been able to do this? I mean, uh, why is it that Israel's stated aims, all of its bluster, why is it that it has not been able to achieve anything that it claims it wanted to achieve? There are some who suspect that it didn't want to achieve any of this at all. But at the same time, there is a military campaign that's going on, even if it is a genocidal one. Why is it that Israel has been such a monumental failure up until this point?
Before I respond, I should add something, and that is that in addition to Iran's response to the Israeli regime, Iran said that we have changed the equation, and that for now on, if the Israeli regime carries out strikes against Iranians or Iranian assets, we will immediately respond. That is a big change. And ever since the Iranian attack, we have not seen the Israelis strike Iranian targets in Syria. So I think that is also an indication of how the Israelis have been forced to shift their policy, their military policy. And it again shows that Iran has the advantage. With regards to Gaza, I think that, this is not just about Gaza, the same is true in Lebanon. The underground network in that Lebanon is much more extensive than Gaza. And that's why the Israelis won't dare attack Lebanon. They won't dare invade Lebanon because Hezbollah's capabilities are far greater than that of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And Hezbollah also has allies in Lebanon, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other groups that work with it. These tunnels have basically made air power almost meaningless because the resistance fighters, they are deep underground. There are hundreds in Gaza, hundreds of kilometers of different tunnels. And then there are smaller tunnels which they dig and carry out operations, and then they wreck those tunnels, and then they create more tunnels. So under Gaza, there is a city of tunnels with hospitals, with different centers for troops to rest, and command centers, and so on. The same is true in Lebanon. The same is true in Yemen. So this has made the Air Force and their helicopter capabilities ineffective. And whenever the Israeli regime says that we bombed this hospital, or we bombed this neighborhood, or we bombed these tents because there was a senior Hamas figure there, they're lying. Everyone, these Hamas commanders are all underground. None of them are walking around among tents or in buildings or anything like that. The Israelis are just justifying their genocide. And the Western media will repeat what the Israelis say, even though they know that Hamas is underground. If they weren't, then this devastation, then the war in Gaza would have ended within a few days. And I actually said, I think almost on the first day, that Gaza will not fall. And I told some of my Palestinian friends who were very concerned that it will not fall. And it wasn't because I've ever been to Gaza, but it's because people who know what's happening, people who have more knowledge about these issues, they know what's going on in the West Bank, in Gaza, and Lebanon, and Syria, and elsewhere. They were confident that Gaza would not fall. So militarily, the big advantage that the Israeli regime had, which was its air force, its capabilities in the air, was made useless, or more or less useless. The second was that the Israeli regime always monitors, it uses American intelligence gathering I mean, all of these technologies that people think Israel has, they're all American. Israel is just a small colony, and then the Americans may invest bring in a few companies and so on, but all this is just American. The Israelis are a weak and vulnerable regime, and now we're seeing it. We're seeing how vulnerable it is. It's only carrying out this war against the people of Gaza with Western support, with these constant, with the British and the Americans and others constantly bringing in new weapons and ammunition. But in any case, the Israeli regime would gather intelligence from Gaza, but throughout the years, not just through high tech capabilities, but also by um, gathering information about people who are vulnerable, someone who may have, I don't know, uh, had an illicit sexual relationship, or someone who may have been gay, or someone who may have done something wrong against their family, or and they would use that information and force people to work as collaborators for them. So the Israelis had different means to gather intelligence about Gaza. But what happened was that through these tunnels, because of these tunnels, the Israelis were it found it very difficult to get information, because the information the tunnels were used to send messages, to receive messages, whether by uh, uh, motorcycles, or by uh, phones that are just internally connected to one another, military phones. So the Israelis lost the ability to understand what was really going on in Gaza. And that is why I think the Israeli regime really never understood how capable the resistance was and how complex these tunnels were. Do you remember? I'm sure you remember that during the first days they were saying that we're going to flood the tunnels with seawater, and we're going to gas uh, the resistance fighter tunnels. Well, what happened? These tunnels are very complex and sophisticated, and they were developed to prevent the Israeli regime from doing this sort of thing. And if you've noticed, and I'm sure we've all noticed, that we constantly get footage of resistance fighters taking out Israeli soldiers or tanks, but there's very little footage of the Israeli regime uh, murdering resistance fighters. And I think that shows that how incapable the regime has become, and that has made them very angry and frustrated, and has led to them increasing the number, or intensifying the genocide. And it is a genocide, and we all know that the Israelis have stopped food and water and electricity. They declared it from day one. And the West knows this. The West supports this. They assist the Israeli regime in starving Gazans. It's a collective war against women and children. But in any case, on the battlefield, the Israeli regime has lost. The same is true in Lebanon. Hezbollah has forced the Israeli regime to empty its towns and small cities in northern Palestine, in occupied Palestine, in Israel. And the Israelis have not been able to do a thing about it. They've been threatening Lebanon for months now that we're going to punish you, we're going to destroy your country, we're going to take it out against all the Lebanese people, which again shows how barbaric the regime is. They threaten ordinary people everywhere, but they haven't done anything because they know that Hezbollah, if 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 this war intensifies further, the Israeli regime has lots of sensitive targets that can be destroyed. Lebanon doesn't have those targets. The military targets are basically underground, and everything else is just our homes and towns. But because of the sanctions and because of the policies of the West, Lebanon doesn't even have electricity. Um, there's very little electricity in the country. So the damage that Hezbollah can do to Israel by destroying its power plants, for example, is far greater than what the Israeli can do to Lebanon.
All right. Well, I mean, I think that was all very important, and I wanted to ask you. I'm sure we will talk again, actually, before this actually all bears fruit, because this appears to be. I think all indications are this is a very protracted struggle that is happening right now. Very protracted war of resistance happening right now in Gaza. But how do you see this ending for the Israelis then? Because there seems to be no light at the end of the tunnel. There appears to be more massacres, more absolute war crimes, but no real light at the end of the tunnel. And as Operation True Promise and and why that occurred, Israel's bombing of the embassy, the murder of very prominent people within the Iranian military. Tell me what you think about how do you think this will end for the Israeli regime?
Well, I think the only thing that exists at the end of the tunnel for the Israelis is more Hezbollah fighters and more Hamas fighters and more Islamic Jihad fighters and more Ansarullah troops. And there is no escape from defeat. There is no road to victory without a doubt, but there's also no road to that will allow them to escape defeat. Every day that this genocide continues only makes it worse for the West and the Israeli regime. The world has turned against the Israeli regime, and it is only entrenching the hatred. A younger generation, day after day, is witnessing this genocide take place. And they're witnessing how Western regimes support the genocide, how they're arming the genocidal forces, how Western media, the BBC, CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, Sky News, Fox News, everyone is trying to help the Israeli regime carry out the genocide with minimal cost. This has been devastating for the West. The Israeli regime, which pretended, along with the West, that it was some regional superpower, has been shown to be weak and vulnerable. It has been shown to be genocidal. And therefore, the whole of the global South is marginalizing the regime, and it is causing the West to be marginalized. Never again can the United States or the Europeans bark about human rights or about human dignity or women's rights or children's rights or minorities or anything. They have to remain silent. They cannot talk about China when after what they've done to Gaza. They can't talk about Russia or anyone for that matter after what they've done. So this every day that this continues, it only entrenches that anger and animosity and hatred. On the other hand, the resistance has become much more confident. The Hamas has not been severely damaged. It continues to fight across the board, and so is the same is true with Islamic Jihad and its allies. They can continue this battle indefinitely. They have new recruits. They're making new tunnels. They have the weapons. They've shown the Israeli Netanyahu claimed that he will take when they take Rafah or when they attack the south, it'll be finished. Nothing is finished. They're fighting losing battles across the board from north to south in Gaza. So the longer this takes, the greater the defeat will be. And ironically, this is all happening as the West is losing in Ukraine and as the West is intensifying conflict with China. So it is only making it worse because managing all these crises at the same time for the West is simply not possible, especially as the West is much weaker today than it was 20, 25 years ago, partially because of their endless wars, partially because of liberal capitalism and the consequences such as the crisis in 2008 and 9 and so on. The United States is not the United States of 30, 40, 50 years ago. The Europeans are much weaker as well. So I don't see any good outcome for the forces of genocide, and also those countries that were quiet. The longer that this lasts, the more unstable they become. Remember when the so-called Arab Spring or the awakening or the Islamic awakening or whatever one calls it, when it happened, it began in Tunisia. The whole region was quiet. But when it happened, when that young man, I think, burned himself alive, it brought about not only the overthrow of the regime, but it also brought about the overthrow of the Egyptian regime, and Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Persian Gulf were terrified about how it could spread to the Persian Gulf region. Today, those countries that are seen to be on the side of the Israeli regime or trading with the regime or having political relations with the regime, their people are going to look at them as traitors. Even Turkey, they've spent so much money on destroying Syria and supporting uh, you know, these terrorists, but they have not. The Turkish government continues to have relations with the Israeli regime, and even as we speak, trade continues after 8 months of what's going on. So it's going to have implications for any government, any politician, any regime that has been seen as siding with the Israeli regime. And we may not see that, uh, uh, we may not see anything today, but remember, right before October the 7th, Jake Sullivan in a speech said that the Middle East, and of course I don't like the term Middle East, it's West Asia, I think it's an Orientalist term, but the Middle East, as he called it, I think he said it has been the most quiet that it's been for many years. And literally days later, we had October the 7th. So when you have these family dictatorships that are working, that are pursuing policies that are completely in opposition to what the demands of the people are, there will be consequences. And therefore, I think that even if there is a ceasefire, I don't think that will be the end of the story. And the longer this continues, the more potential instability there is for those regimes that were quiet or indifferent or let alone supportive of this apartheid regime.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And I wanted to cover one more thing with you, Professor Marandi, while I have you. I wanted to talk about Iran's role in the multipolar world. You mentioned the US and its unipolar imperial order being just absolutely outstretched in West Asia, in Ukraine, via NATO, and of course in the Asia Pacific, targeting China. But I wanted to ask you about Iran's role in this emerging alternative world order, given that it has recently joined BRICS, that it does have really robust relations with Russia and China. From your perspective, being in Iran, could you talk about the significance of Iran's global role in this way and its partnerships with the what I think the United States views, of course, as the ultimate engine of multipolarity, Russia and China?
I think the biggest achievement of President Raisi was his foreign policy. And he was able to change Iran's relationships with many countries. He traveled a lot across the country. He went to each province at least once a year, and he would go to the and he would focus on the most deprived areas in these provinces. But he also traveled a lot abroad, and he visited many countries. He went to Indonesia, he went to Pakistan, Sri Lanka, China, Russia. He went to Africa, to a number of countries in Africa and Latin America, and in the region. He traveled a lot during these 3 years, and he built up ties with non-Western countries. And as you pointed out, he succeeded in joining or having Iran join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which and there will be a summit in a couple of months from now. He also succeeded, or he uh, did what needed to be done to get Iran into BRICS. Iran's relationship with Russia and China has evolved. Iran's relationship with India has evolved. He's also been focusing on transport corridors, the north-south corridor between that links Russia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, Belarus to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, but also the Belt and Road Initiative. So he's made Iran the center for, or is developing Iran as the center for commerce and trade and the transportation of goods. And he's also been able to bring about rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, something which began with General Soleimani. General Soleimani was traveling from Syria to Iraq to meet the Iraqi prime minister at that time, Dr. Adel Abdul Mahdi, when the Americans murdered General Soleimani. Why wasn't he in Iraq? the prime minister of Iraq at that time said he was supposed to meet me in the morning to discuss a letter from Saudi Arabia regarding rapprochement. So General Soleimani was going to Baghdad to help bring about rapprochement when the Americans murdered him. And obviously, that is very much a part of the reason why he was killed. The Americans did not want rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Americans don't want rapprochement between any of the countries in the region. They want all the countries to be divided. So the process continued with negotiations in Iraq and in Oman, but ultimately through Chinese mediation, the Iranians and the Saudis were reestablished ties. So his objective was to establish strong ties with neighboring countries, both political, cultural, but also economic ties, and to help create a greater integration among Asian countries. Iran is in the West, China in the East, India in the South, and of course, Central Asia and Russia. And BRICS is especially important because BRICS has the potential to circumvent US financial institutions and the US dollar so that countries across the global South can do trade and business without being threatened or impeded by the United States. So a lot has been done. A lot of changes have taken place. The world is changing, and as these changes are taking place, the United States continues to antagonize countries like China, intensifying the war with Russia in a way in which they are becoming increasingly ambivalent about the role of NATO forces, which is extremely dangerous. But also the United States has demolished its image across the world for showing itself to be genocidal and also weak, because the United States has failed in the Red Sea, something that I failed to mention. They failed against Yemen. They failed against the Americans for a decade helped starve Yemen. They helped with the genocide against Yemen. And now Yemen has defeated the Americans in the Red Sea. And the only thing that the Americans and the British can do is bomb radio stations and kill innocent people in response. So the United States has destroyed its image. The West has destroyed its image. They've destroyed their the image that they had of some superior, exceptional power. And therefore, I think that as we move forward, Iran's relationship with countries in the global South will continue to expand. And ultimately, the West, if they have sane politicians, they will start thinking about rebuilding their ties with Iran. Otherwise, they will continue to isolate themselves further in our region, and I think across the world.
Thanks, Professor Marandi. As you were speaking, a question came to mind about just how this has impacted Iran. I haven't even mentioned the just absolutely horrific sanctions that the United States imposes upon Iran. And so I wanted to ask you, how has Iran's growing role in the multipolar world order, its relationships with other champions and engines of this new alternative order, how has that assisted Iran? Because the theory is that these sanctions on Iran are supposed to starve Iran. Iranian people will rise up, they'll overthrow the government that the US doesn't like, and Iran will be another vassal state to the United States like the others in the region and globally. So could you talk about how its emerging role in the multipolar world order and these relationships that you spoke of have assisted Iran in terms of being able to achieve not just resilience, but also progress in the face of these illegal sanctions?
Well, first, I think it shows how inhumane and barbaric the United States, the regime in the United States, and regimes in Europe are. The fact that they use sanctions targeting women and children for political gains shows that they are really no different from the Israeli regime, and that's why they support this Holocaust in Gaza as well. It's because they have no sense of morality. They are shameless and immoral. They target Iranians. They kill Iranians through sanctions to get, because for them the end justifies the means. But what they have done is that while hurting many Iranians, without a doubt, they've created an incentive for the Iranians to become more independent. So today you see that Iranian military capabilities are among the best in the world. Iranian drones and missiles of different types are in demand in a way in which that's only the case with a handful of countries. So Iran's been able to create an indigenous military capability and save a lot of money that way. The Iranians also began to develop their own industries, their own high-tech industries. Iran's one of the most advanced countries in nanotechnology, in stem cell research, and so on. So Iran has been able to develop indigenous capabilities as a result of the sanctions, but also what the United States has done is it has created an incentive for Iran to become more global. In the past, the focus was on relations with the West. Now Iran is exploring ties with countries that in the past they only had diplomatic relations with, but now they are really doing business with Indonesia, with countries across South Asia, with Central Asian countries. Railroads are being created. So the world is changing. So Iran, a lot of the things that in the past the Iranians depended on the West to obtain, now they obtain them through China, they obtain them through Russia, or Iran can export. The needs of Russia are now being met by Iran. The trade relations between Iran and Russia has grown significantly over the past 2-3 years. The same is true with China. China sees Iran as an independent country that it can rely on. So it wants to buy its oil from Iran because it knows that Iran will not be influenced by Western threats. But that's not necessarily the case with other oil or energy producing countries. So in the short term, the Americans have caused a lot of damage. But in the long term, the Americans in the West have done more damage to themselves than to anyone else.
Yeah, and I think it's underestimated just how rapid and quickly Iran's influence and its economic development has transpired. I mean, maybe you could close with just talking about that. These sanctions are supposed to impoverish Iran. They're supposed to create a situation for Iran that is untenable for the people. Maybe you could close on just what you have seen over the years in terms of Iran's development in the face of what is an act of war. Sanctions are supposed to destroy people's lives. They are used for political and military purposes. So perhaps I know that your time is very valuable. So you could close on over the years, what have you seen?
Well, life in Iran is difficult. I mean, the sanctions have been going on for many years. So I'm not saying that Iran is some sort of utopia, but if you compare, for example, the metro in Tehran with the metro in New York, uh, the metro in Tehran is far, far better. Or, for example, again, in the past, Iran was surrounded by the United States. The Americans occupied Afghanistan and Iraq. Now Iran has allies in Iraq, it has allies in Syria, it has allies in Yemen. The Americans have withdrawn. And now the Israeli regime, the key US ally in the world, is surrounded by the axis of resistance. So in 2003, Iran was surrounded. Now the Israeli regime is more or less surrounded. But most importantly, I think that President Raisi's demise um, revealed something, and that is that contrary to all the rhetoric about Iran in the West and the propaganda, that the Islamic Republic of Iran has a large amount of legitimacy. It has a huge amount of legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. Millions of people went to the streets of Tehran for the funeral. No one can deny that. The footage is there. millions across the country went in the different funeral processions participated as well. Why is that the case? Can the Americans ever muster such support? Right now, you see what's going on in the United States with Biden and Trump. So uh, there must, the Americans in the West have to rethink. There is something about Iran that, despite all the sanctions, despite all the hostility, despite all the anti-Iran propaganda, the number of anti-Iranian Persian language media funded by Western governments is extraordinarily high. There's nothing else like it in the world. The anti-Russian or anti-Chinese or anti-Venezuelan media that is funded by Western countries pay, they're nothing compared to what they're doing against Iran. They're more Persian channel, Persian language media outlets against Iran than there are inside the country. But despite the propaganda, the sanctions, the strangulation, why is it that people come in such numbers to the streets for the funeral of their president? So maybe, just maybe, your listeners and viewers should think about this. I know your listeners and viewers are politically aware, but I mean, in general, maybe people should start thinking that about uh, why this is the case, and perhaps Iran is maybe just not as evil and such a dystopia as they've been told over the last 47 years.
Yeah, indeed, Professor Marandi. I was actually, as you mentioned, the metro station, the YouTube algorithm was doing its work and probably knew I was interviewing you at this point and sent me a a vlog of the Iranian metro in Tehran, and it was quite nice and much cleaner, much more functional than the New York City subway, which is racked by an aging and crumbling infrastructure. But in any case, Professor Marandi, do you have any closing comments? I know that you have a very busy schedule. Any closing comments you have for viewers? Anything you want to share before I let you go?
No, I just think that your viewers are very politically aware, so this may not be necessary, but the focus should remain on Gaza. All of us have to do whatever we can to create greater awareness, to support the people of Gaza, to support the resistance, a legitimate resistance, just as legitimate as the resistance, military resistance against apartheid, South Africa. It's our responsibility to stand up against genocide, and I hope that no matter how difficult life is and how much work we all have, that we spend a bit of time, as much time every day as we can, to continue creating greater awareness, because I think this is what is really the most dangerous thing for uh, the Zionist regime.
Well, Professor Morandi, I am so glad I was able to and we were able to work this out. I will definitely have to have you on again now that the arrangement that we made actually does work with the tech side of all of this. So, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening, and hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope you and the audience, you all have a very excellent day ahead of you.
Okay, well, that was Professor Saeed Mohammad Marandi joining me today from Tehran. It was great to be with him. Please do hit that like button. I am sticking around, actually, probably for another story. So do hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notifications bell. Let's keep viewers here. I'm going to cover one story probably before I head out myself. We have about 3,400 people watching. Great audience. Thank you so much for tuning in to Professor Marandi. It was a great conversation. So glad I was able to make that happen. It was long overdue. So keep hitting that like button. That gets more viewers in here. The more viewers in here, there's always a playback. So they'll be able to hear Professor Marandi at the very beginning of this program as well. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. If you want to support this show, first off, you can find Professor Marandi's Twitter in the video description, but you can also find in the video description all the ways you can support this channel from Patreon. You can become a monthly member. That is always very much helpful, or annual member. Most people like that better. You can become an annual or monthly member on Substack. Here on YouTube, you can become a monthly member. And of course, there are one-time options as well for those if that works better for you. And that includes Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, and much more. So thank you so much all for tuning in. Thanks so much again to Professor Marandi for joining this program. I cannot wait to actually have him on again because I feel like I learned a lot, and that's the kind of conversation I love to engage in here on this channel, dedicated to getting the geopolitical, getting the global analysis that we just don't get in the mainstream Western media. So I want to um, cover one story here with all of you before I head out. We'll do Ukraine. Let's shift the topic a bit here. How about that? It is a doozy of a topic, but I'm just going to pull up all the sources so there's no need to jump around. I did receive a criticism for someone on Patreon recently who left the membership saying, that there was, production issues. I am my own producer. I was running all production with Marandi over Zoom. Very challenging, but I did have to pay for Zoom because you need to get the one that you pay for so it doesn't go away after 40 minutes or something. So all of this does take money. All of this does have costs. So please do. Support the show if you can. It all goes back to the work. So let us get started. Okay, here we go. Hold on one second. One of my sources isn't working. Let me just get this up. Here we go. Got it. The United States and NATO are once again testing Russia's red lines. And as we have seen throughout the conflict in Ukraine, the United States and NATO have tested these red lines to the point where Russia has been pushed into very dramatic responses, ones that could bring World War III about. For example, a tactical nuclear drills being conducted just this past May. But this red line is even more significant, in my opinion, even in the past when we had David Cameron, for example, and Emmanuel Macron talk about using Western weapons given to Ukraine on Russia and in Russian territory. Now, this policy is becoming universal among NATO members. And of course, when we're talking about NATO, we're talking about the United States. So the United States is now giving the green light after several weeks of hand wringing, of saying that it was not going to do this. Now, according to the Politico, we are now seeing the Biden administration green light permission to Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to strike Russia. And what Russia has said is this makes the United States a party to the conflict in a way that means U.S. assets, U.S. targets are now possibly under the under the auspices of what Russia can strike back at. But we're going to get into that soon. But here's a story, a major reversal that will help Ukraine better defend its second largest city. Biden secretly is giving Ukraine permission to strike inside of Russia with U.S. weapons. The Biden administration has quietly given Ukraine permission to strike inside of Russia solely near the area of Kharkov, using U.S. provided weapons, 3 officials of the United States and 2 other people familiar with the move said on May 30th, a major reversal that will help Ukraine better defend its second largest city. The president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use U.S. weapons to counter fire purposes in Kharkov so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces hitting them or preparing to hit them, the U.S. official said, adding the policy of not allowing long-range strikes inside Russia has not changed. Ukraine has been asking the U.S. to make this official policy change only after Russia's offensive in Kharkov began this month. The official added, all the people were granted anonymity to discuss internal decisions that have not yet been announced. So this is essentially a leak, according to the sources. So this has been happening over the past several weeks, more so-called flexibility. But there is a contradiction in these reports. And here is what the New York Times had to say, because I want to show you who have already, and this is a universal policy within NATO dictated by the United States. This was the New York Times report taking the fight to Russia. This has been the mantra of late. The West weighs Ukraine's use of its weapons. More NATO allies are backing Kiev's plea to allow forces to conduct strikes in Russian territory with Western weapons. But let me go to the section where it talks about those backing strikes on Russian soil. It says every country giving weapons to Ukraine has the right to prescribe how they were used, according to New York Times. And so far, Britain, Canada, Czech Republic, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Poland have stated their support for Ukraine hitting military targets on Russian territory. Then you have countries that are more cautious. Germany and Sweden, for example, conditioned approval solely within the framework of international law, which is hilarious because none of this can actually be justified with international law. He was spelling out a requirement that other countries have also maintained over the past 2 years arming Ukraine, even if it was not voiced prominently. So Britain was one of the first to argue loosening the restraints, as I mentioned, with Foreign Minister David Cameron's visit to Kiev, saying it has the right to use whatever it wants. Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can't quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself, or you can understand. But here's what the United States, Belgium, and Italy, several countries, said they're not ready to let Ukraine use weapons inside of Russia to target Russian assets, citing that risks which can be hard to anticipate. So there you have the New York Times basically saying something completely different. I think this just shows how completely and utterly useless uh, the United States is, these so-called anonymous officials. It is quite clear that this is the official policy nonetheless. But I wanted to show you how Vladimir Putin and Russia particularly might respond. This has been making the rounds, and a lot of people have been saying that this is Vladimir Putin calling for total war. Now, Vladimir Putin often gives speeches, and here's just a snippet of one recently where he talks about how Russians all over the country, all Russians, and everyone who is involved in Russian society should be viewing the current historical situation. And this speech was directly given after many European countries have voiced their support for Ukraine using their weapons to target Russian territory.
Но прошу вас обратить внимание вот на что. Мы все понимаем, во всяком случае, все должны понимать, в какое время мы живем и через какой исторический этап проходит Россия. А если мы это понимаем, то все должны работать как на линии фронта. Все должны чувствовать себя мобилизованными. И только так мы добьемся тех целей, которые перед собой ставим.
So that should be chilling for the United States, for NATO, for the neocons that are directing this policy, because that is exactly the approach that friend of the show, Scott Ritter, has talked about here, where the entirety of Russian society is mobilized, as Vladimir Putin said, and is mobilizing like they are on the front, meaning that they are not only prepared to give their lives for the special military operation, but they're willing to give their lives for Russia, making these threats absolutely and utterly just not just irresponsible, but incredibly dangerous, given the fact that any kind of conflict between Russia, the United States, and NATO, the US and NATO as one, in direct conflict with Russia, will lead to a cataclysmic war that would inevitably go nuclear. And Russia is not so much hesitating to state this fact, whatever one may think of it. Here is what an article, an intelligence drop. It's time for Russia to drop a nuclear bomb. This was written by a member of the Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. deputy director of world economy and international politics at Moscow's Higher School of Economics. And he said the U.S. bloc has lost its fear of the mushroom cloud, but seeing one perhaps may focus some minds. So again, this was written on the Intel drop directly after it was announced that several European countries, NATO countries, and now the United States have decided to, and this is a direct response to an argument being made inside of Russian policy and think tank circles that maybe, just maybe, there needs to be a nuclear bomb dropped. And I want to just scroll down to the reasons for why, for what Russia should do. So in response to this threat, because this is what this author is addressing, he said, we should first tell the US and NATO roughly what Moscow already told London after Cameron's words about Ukraine's right to strike anywhere with British Storm Shadow missiles. Namely, that in the event of an attack on quote unquote old Russian territory, Moscow reserves the right to strike any facilities of the countries concerned, including the US and anywhere in the world. There are many American military bases dotted around the globe. Yes, the United States has 800 plus military bases, and there is no shortage of those in the so-called Central and Eastern European axis. Secondly, it is important to officially declare if the U.S. and NATO launches a non-nuclear strike on Russian territory in response to such a Russian strike, Moscow may in turn use nuclear weapons in full accordance with the fundamentals of Russian state policy in the field of nuclear deterrence. Thirdly, since there has been talk of possible attacks not only on British but also on American facilities and of a possible direct military response from the U.S., it would be desirable to hold exercises on the use of strategic nuclear forces in addition to the current exercise on the use of tactical weapons. So what he is actually describing is the escalation ladder, that this move by the United States and by NATO to approve weapons given to Ukraine to be used on Russian soil then makes the United States and NATO direct parties to the war, and their assets will be targeted. And if they are targeted, you can expect the United States and NATO to respond and target Russian assets directly. And then that's where you have the escalation ladder, which he is describing. And he mentioned the drills that I talked about that were conducted in May and that will continue to be ongoing for Russia, that those drills should be escalated if this were to happen to more strategic nuclear forces, not just tactical weapons, meaning that these drills will not just get bigger, but the weapons that will be deployed, the nuclear weapons that will be deployed, will be more damaging. And then finally, to confirm the seriousness of Russia's intentions and to convince our adversaries of Moscow's willingness to escalate, it's worth considering a demonstration, i.e. non-aggressive nuclear explosion. The political and psychological effect of an atomic mushroom cloud broadcast live on all the world's television channels will hopefully bring Western politicians back to one thing to prevented wars between great powers after 1945, in which they have now largely lost: the fear of nuclear war. So that's a very serious. Now, one might say, okay, well, how much influence does this particular person have? Where are they actually in Russian, in terms of influence over Russia government policy, Russian military policy? Well, that is unclear, but the fact that it is being published, that it means that it is being talked about. And that's being talked about likely at the highest levels of official Russia, but also at the levels of those who are involved in the special military operation, those who are looking at this from the Russian side and saying, well, how does one stop these escalations? How does one prevent the United States and NATO from doing the unthinkable? What does Russia have to do to reestablish deterrence? Because obviously what's happening is not working. The United States and NATO are still willing to go another extra mile to bring the world closer to nuclear Armageddon. And so these warnings should be taken very, very seriously from Vladimir Putin when he says everyone should operate like they are on the front, meaning that everything that they do, everything that people do, that this is a real wartime situation for Russia. It is not in the United States and NATO countries, the US and NATO countries. There is no perspective on this. This is simply a proxy war that is over there, where US weapons are over there, and all of the negative impact, all of the negative perceptions of this conflict are all based on how it is not reflecting and not benefiting U.S. national interests, meaning that people in the United States are not benefiting from the war. And that is all important. But nonetheless, it does not mean that anyone in the United States, for the most part, views this war as existential, other than the most fanatical Banderite supporting forces that exist in the collective West. That's a tiny minority of the overall general population, just like the electorate in the United States actually is a minority of the US population. But nonetheless, those who vote. But nonetheless, it is important now. I wanted to bring it to friend of the show, Scott Ritter, who gave a great report for Sputnik on this issue. So I wanted to hear how he weighs in on this, because I think usually his analysis is generally important to this, because he has expertise in military affairs. So here we go. Here's friend of the show, Scott Ritter, for Sputnik. He gave this analysis in response to the news that there will be weapons from the United States and from NATO striking Russian territory.
President Putin made it clear that he understands how these systems work. Therefore, that means that the Russians understand what needs to be targeted. Locations not only inside Ukraine, but on the soil of NATO members. Now, the NATO members and NATO itself will claim that this support of Ukraine is being done by sovereign states, not by NATO as an entity. So when Russia retaliates against the sovereign states, NATO better not rally around these nations and suddenly proclaim Article 5 collective self-defense protections. Because if they do that, then it's clear that this is a NATO confrontation against Russia. And if NATO chooses then to respond by launching additional attacks against Russia, remember, these aren't retaliation attacks. Russia is retaliating against NATO attacks against its territory. This would be an all-out assault by NATO against Russia, and former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev made it clear that the Russian response would be nuclear, and this would lead to a general nuclear exchange in the end of the world. That's where we're at right now. This isn't about helping Ukraine. This isn't about Ukraine defending itself. This is about a larger plan by the collective West, by NATO, by the United States to strategically defeat Russia. Now, in some ways, Russia is to blame here. Let me say why. Because Russia continuously says that it is seeking a peaceful solution. Russia continuously indicates it is looking for a negotiated settlement. These Russian postures, which are very reasonable, are being misinterpreted in the West as a sign of Russian weakness. And therefore, the collective determination of the West is that they just continue to pressure Russia, ratchet up the pressure, that Russia will fold like a house of cards and run to the peace table and bring an end to this conflict. That's not going to happen. This is a misreading of the situation by the West. And so the West now will attack Russia, trying to pressure Russia to the peace table. But all it will do is guarantee a Russian response that if the West doesn't respond properly to that, if the West thinks that it therefore has a right to strike Russia in return, will lead to Armageddon, the end of the world. That's where we're at today. This isn't a game. This isn't a joke. This is the end of all humanity.
Yeah, I mean that's where things are headed with this conflict, and it's a very important point that Scott made there about peace, about how Russia has essentially inconsistently communicated that it is willing to engage in peaceful negotiations should Russia's position be respected, should Russia have a rightful seat at the table. I mean, when we talk about Zelensky's so-called peace initiative that China and Joe Biden himself have not even committed to, China won't commit to it, and you'll never see that. But even Joe Biden has refused. I think he decided to choose a rich donor fest, the money he wants to raise for his what will likely be a failed presidential campaign. He decided to attend this instead. Nonetheless, Russia has been the single force in this conflict. If we think about the players in this conflict being Russia, Ukraine, NATO, of course, with the United States at the head. It has been Russia as a single force consistently talking about negotiations being a top priority. And Scott is right. This means that those who have no interest in negotiations, those very forces inside of the United States and NATO that sabotaged the Minsk Accords, that made it so the peace plan that was signed by Ukraine in late March and April of 2022 was also jettisoned, that these same forces that spurred these horrific developments, that created the conditions for this ongoing, protracted war of attrition that exists now, that has taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and has created a complete rump state, essentially, in Ukraine, an illegitimate proxy where Zelensky is not even viewed as the legitimate leader anymore as of May 20th, 2024, where you have just this dire situation in Ukraine, all created by the circumstances laid out by the United States and NATO. It is indeed true that these very same forces, the neocons, view Russia as weak for its position on negotiations, that there are significant forces inside of the collective West that want to see a larger campaign of war. That is why this has always been so serious. It is not just that the United States has some kind of military objective for Ukraine. No, it is about getting Russia to fold, as Scott said, like a house of cards, to be dismembered, to be destabilized, to crumble, to fall, to have Vladimir Putin and his leadership be overtaken and supplanted by a more Yeltsin-like kind of regime. It's absolute fantasy given the balance of forces politically in the United States. But when has that ever stopped the United States before? We can look at what's happening in Gaza right now, where you have the axis of resistance, as Professor Marandi said on this show. Seyed Mohammad Marandi said Israel is the one that is surrounded by resistance forces and has no hope for victory, yet the United States supports Israel unconditionally nonetheless. There are no red lines there for Israel that the United States won't absolutely cave to. The same goes for the Asia Pacific. Where in the hell can we see an actual victory for the United States against China in the Asia Pacific militarily, let alone in any other area? And they're all connected, as we know. China's rapid economic development is not ceasing. We can see absolutely just incredible developments, from curing diabetes with cell therapy. Now there is a test and a trial happening where an individual has actually not been insulin dependent for many months after 3 months of cell therapy. And then we also have a BYD vehicle that can go 2,000 kilometers about to be rolled out, a hybrid vehicle about to be rolled out, the distance between New York to Miami. These are developments that show the United States militarily has no chance if China. I've been to China 3 times. Never did I get the sense that anyone is afraid of war or believes they're at war. The United States, though, is preparing for such a thing, and that's what is happening in Ukraine. No one in everyone in Russia understands the call here. That is what Scott Ritter has said on this program over and over again. And I think it's quite clear from these escalations that the United States and NATO absolutely have no off ramp. They have no restraint. And Russia is going to have to be the one, just like China, just like Iran, just like all countries in the multipolar world, especially the leaders of it, are going to face one way or another. They're going to face the reality that they are going to have to either establish a deterrence. They're going to have to show the United States and NATO the recklessness of its moves. They're going to have to do what the United States always says about Russia, about China, about Iran. This is what they always say, that the United States has to be the one to show that China, for example, would be absolutely devastated if it were to invade Taiwan. Well, actually, the truth is that Russia, China, Iran, these countries, they're going to have to be the ones. They already have shown that they need to be the ones to establish deterrence. And so, in the case of Russia here, we are seeing that Russia is already contemplating how to do this, and that it could involve an escalation, a move up the escalation ladder toward nuclear war, a nuclear demonstration. Now, if a nuclear demonstration were to occur, this would absolutely uh, uh, just the minds, the heads would come skyrocketing off. They would be just absolutely blown away by this show of force, and of course, if not done correctly, could lead toward a path of no return. But we can be confident that Russia is not going to, of course, participate in any kind of nuclear actions in this way that would do this. If Iran's Operation True Promise, for example, is any indication, the multipolar world understands that it has to be the one that is restrained. It has to be the one that thinks strategically and that thinks about the betterment of humanity when it is seeking out deterrent policies. So we can expect Russia to move through this strategically in a step by step fashion. We're already seeing that with the tactical nuclear drills. We're seeing that with major warnings. Should US weapons, should NATO weapons officially begin hitting Russian territory, should that be then, they already have been, let's be honest, Belgorod. We know that these weapons are supplied by the United States and NATO, but once they have the official stamp on it, and once they begin to take the form of an actual military campaign in response and in retaliation to Russia's successful offensive in Kharkov. Remember, this is all about a successful move in Kharkov to secure that area so that these attacks cannot happen. This is what Vladimir Putin has said from the very beginning about why there is a campaign, right? Why there is an offensive in Kharkov in particular. But once that happens, we will see Russia's response, and Russia will go through this escalation ladder, and it will test NATO's capacity for restraint. There will be strikes on NATO armaments. This has been happening from the very beginning. There will be a retribution, but I believe Russia will keep this within the bounds of Ukraine. We are not going to see Russia strike NATO installations, NATO sites, the United States proper. That's not going to happen. And certainly that's not going to happen anytime soon. But nonetheless, what the United States, what NATO knows, and what we should all be aware of is that this means that Russia will accelerate its campaign and will continue to make significant progress on the battlefield against Ukraine when everything is going against Ukraine, from the political situation becoming increasingly unstable. Zelensky is bullying the United States, is lashing out, firing people close to the United States. It's an absolute nightmare right now for the US and NATO project in Ukraine. So we can expect Russia to continue to make its very methodical moves to neutralize the situation. But we all know that the real head of the monster here is the United States and NATO. And that is where the unpredictability lies, because the more that Russian victory becomes inevitable, the more desperate the United States becomes to prevent it. So we will all have to be on very close watch on what happens, because Vladimir Putin, Russia in general, they're not bluffing. This is not a bluff. This is not, oh, we are not going to respond in any kind of way. No, there will be retaliation. It's just that Russia is far smarter in how it goes about this than the United States and NATO, and understands who it is facing and what it is facing. How long ago was it that Dmitry Peskov said that the Russia is at war, knows it is at war with NATO? Given this, it is going to take all the measures into account to ensure that such a conflict and such a war does not bleed in, spill over into our worst nightmare, which is nuclear war. But that doesn't mean that Russia isn't talking about it, isn't preparing for it, and cannot engage in it once the United States and NATO shows that it is all that is left at the disposal to stop it from essentially destroying Russia and destroying the multipolar, or attempting to destroy the multipolar world order. That is what Russia, and I believe Russian people, will sacrifice a lot to protect. And that is what is at stake here. So we all have to be on very close watch on what the United States and what NATO is doing, and be ready to address the real problem here. The real problem here, which resides in Washington, the Pentagon, the CIA, and of course, NATO proper. All right, everybody. That is the story for today. Okay, I want to do at least one story. So a few announcements before I end. I'm going to do shout outs. Okay, we have 2,600 people watching. Continue to hit that like button. Okay. Oh, it's actually the likes have gone way up. Amazing. A few announcements. Today at 8 p.m. Eastern time, I will be on Sabby Stabs. Let me actually show you her channel. So I don't know if she's put up the, oh yeah, there we go. The live is already up. Okay. We are going to talk about a lot of things. My recent trip to China, what's happening in the world. I just put the link in the video, not the video description, in the chat, but I can also put the link in the video description. Okay. At 8 p.m. Eastern time. Okay. So I just did that. If you prefer to save the link in the video description, you can see it there as well. So I'll be on Sabby's channel at 8 p.m. Eastern. Be sure to watch it here. There might be clips of it coming up here as well. I know she puts up clips, but I might use it for clips because there's many announcements. It'll be a quieter time here on the channel very soon. We are in the last day of May. So I don't know if YouTube does this, but I know for Patreon members, whoever's in the audience, Patreon, Substack, etc., sometimes the financial information on those places can get quite dicey. So do so if you're a Patreon member here. Go to Patreon, just check your financial information, make sure Patreon isn't kicking you off the rolls. This is a problem with a lot of membership kind of platforms. Okay. But with that said, let me just give you some announcements on what is coming up. So I will be not streaming. I might stream tomorrow individually. Be on the lookout for that. It is potentially possible that I do that. Let's say if I am not here, then if I am not streaming tomorrow, then I will be back likely Tuesday. All right. Tuesday in June. And then in terms of guests, I believe on Thursday I have Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. So save that date. I should actually contact him just to make sure that we are all set. But Thursday, I'm supposed to interview Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson at 8 p.m. What am I saying? I believe that'll be 1 p.m. Eastern. The next day, that's June 6th. The next day, I will have on Mark Sloboda, friend of the show, frequent. He frequently comes on the show. So there might be 3 streams next week, if I do not stream tomorrow. So those are the announcements on what's coming up. And then I think the next week I'm going to try to have Pepe Escobar on if he can find some time in Russia to step away, or if he's back from Russia by that time. I'm not so sure what his plans are, but I am working with him to try to get him on to talk about his experience at the St. Pete's Forum and other things happening in the multipolar world. So that hopefully will be June 11th. I will let you know. June 13th to July 2nd, there will be no streams on this channel. I will be putting up clips. I don't know how many I'll be able to get up here in that time period. I usually am quite aggressive when it comes to this situation of going away for a while. But I don't know how many I will be able to get up and whatnot. But this channel will be active. So be sure if you didn't catch the stream or couldn't catch the whole thing, or haven't caught past streams, you will see clips coming up for that time. Then I return July 2nd, I believe, and I will be back rolling. Not sure what plans are after that, but I wanted to let you all know that is the situation. Okay, that is the situation for me. I don't think there are any other announcements, so let me do the shout outs. Okay, first, let me shout out to the moderators. Who do we have here today? We have Desert Mantis. Thanks so much. Creative Experiments. Thanks so much. Who else do we have here? The Desert. I see Creative Experiments. I don't know if I see anyone else here. So it is an off time. 12 noon Eastern is not generally when I go live. Well, that's quite all right. Anything else? Okay, and then Where Pilgrim, I see you. Okay. And YouTube members, of course, I see Hussein. Thanks so much. I believe we have a new YouTube member. I don't know if I saw any other YouTube members, but let me shout out those who gave super chats right now. Thanks so much, all the Patreon members and Substack members, if you're in the chat or in the audience as well. All of your help goes a long way to supporting this channel and supporting this work, really, all the work that I do. It keeps me able to do it without the financial hardship that is so difficult for so many, and it allows me to focus more time to expand things, to have time to, for example, which I almost did not have time for this, and I'm so glad I did, to get Professor Mohammad Marandi on using Zoom. There's a whole learning process. I want to thank DD Geopolitics, especially um, the person at DD Geopolitics that helps me with things like thumbnails and whatnot. I want to just give a big shout out to them and to him for putting up with me as he helped me test this system out. So anyway, let me do the super chats. First, we have Angelica Weller. Thanks so much, Angelica, for becoming a YouTube member. Really appreciate it. That's $3.99 per month. You get early announcements, and you get the you get to support this show. Should more time arise, I'm hoping to try to do things like members only live streams. For now, it's looking like that will have to wait until I can figure out some things about this schedule that I have here. We have Hussein, who's, I believe you are also a YouTube member, correct? No, it doesn't say you are, but according to the chat, I believe this is the same Hussein, correct? In any event, Hussein, I wanted to say thank you for Yemen reacting to U.S.-UK aggression by attacking and hitting U.S. carrier USS Eisenhower, I believe, not in the Red Sea, but Eisenhower, having today the largest protest ever in Sana'a. Thanks so much for that report. Yes, I have heard about that. Heard about Yemen doing that. So thanks so much. Hussein asked again, Professor, do you have professional preference for president? I didn't get to ask this question, but thank you so much. Out of the candidates right now, I mean, I will say that Jill Stein is the person, and I'm actually trying to work with Jill Stein to get her on the program, but is the person that I would support. I have voted for her in the past in 2016. So here we have Hussein again. God bless Iran, its effort to get justice. Thanks so much for that. Hussein again. Wow, Hussein. Hussein said, do Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt fear that free democratic Palestine would be the beginning of the end of all dictatorships in the area? I mean, I would say this is a definite yes. First of all, in Palestine, such an arrangement cannot work and will not work. We already see the Palestinian Authority, while it is not a so-called familial or, aristocratic, monarchic regime like a lot of these states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt is not really that kind of regime either, but it is a military regime in many respects. It doesn't work. In the West Bank, we've seen how it doesn't work. The Palestinian Authority, it's not working as it is currently constituted. Anything that happens in Gaza and Palestine, anything that unites all of Palestine, will definitely have a far different political character because the resistance is so diverse. It's so multitudinous. There's so many political strands. It would have to be something that unites on a coalition basis and creates policy that that allows these various forces to have a voice. There's just no doubt about that. So Hussein, thanks so much for that question. It is very much appreciated because it would be an example. No doubt about it. It would be an example, just like the axis of resistance as a whole is an example of what it means to be sovereign, what it means to be independent. Hussein did then join as a member. So thanks so much for joining as a member, Hussein. All of this is great. And then another super chat from Hussein said, Yemen hit the USS Liberty Day. It did not sink, but Yemen sent a clear message in the psychological state of the Navy men on board hit its lowest. Yes, I believe it was the USS Eisenhower. No, maybe I'm wrong there. But in any event, yes, morale is should be very low. And then here's Hussein again. Another super chat from Hussein. Okay. Thanks so much for this. Then we have Soleimani was a general and an MER at once. Yeah. Keep up the great work, Danny, says Tainer Kaplan Kieran. Thanks so much. I will do my best. Thank you so much for your support. Then we have Arlene, longtime viewer. Thank you, Danny. I think the collective West should take heed. Well, U.S. hegemony is done. Look forward to the stream tonight on Abby's show. Oh, no, not Abby's. Certainly, I believe, it's Savvy. So maybe you missed the S. But yes, I will be on Savvy Sab's show, not Abby. So some people might confuse this with Abby Martin. No, I'm not on the Empire Files today. A little bit of a dream of mine, but nonetheless, I will not be on that today. Okay. But shout out to Abby Martin. But no, this will be the Savvy Sab show. Thank you so much, Arlene. The video link is in the description. So you can find that in the description. Be sure to check it out. So yeah, everybody, this was a great stream today. Wow, I enjoyed speaking with Professor Marandi. It was a great conversation. I believe we covered a lot of territory in the hour that we had together. This was a great stream, everybody. Be sure before I head out of here to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Be sure to go to the video description and find all the places where you can support this work. The best being annual membership on Patreon or annual membership on Substack. But of course, you can become a member here on YouTube. You can also do one-time donations to PayPal and buy me a coffee. I will be sure to announce, as I always do, on the community portion of YouTube, as well as all my social media, which can be found. You can see X at Spirit of Ho. You can find me on Telegram, China and Geopolitics. I'm not sure if I link those in the video description. Generally, I do. But anywhere I share, anywhere I am on social media, I share. Yes, I have Telegram. My link tree is in there. We can find all my social media. So you'll find me, then, I announce all these streams, but be sure to hit that notifications bell and support any way you can. So with that said, everybody, we are going to close up here. Okay. We're going to close up here. Thanks, everyone. Shout out to everyone on Rumble who was watching. I want to promote this. Let me promote Rumble right now, actually. I was getting some criticism that I was not promoting it enough. But let me do that right now. I'm going to share the screen with you. Then I'm going to put the link in the video description. So here's my Rumble channel. Okay. I'm going to put the link in the video, not video description, in the chat. I will also put the link in the video description. Okay. Where you can subscribe on Rumble. It's very important. So you can find that now. Go to the video description as well and find me on Rumble. All my streams go up here. I am not able to do the clips on here. I thought Rumble is supposed to automatically bring up the clips, but it has not done that. In any event, all the streams are here that you will find that I've done. And so you can find my streams here, and you can always find me going live here. So do support my Rumble channel going on Rumble. I want to also shout out everybody on Rockfin. Thank you, Laura, for the tip on Rockfin. So you can also find me on rockfin.com as well. Danny Dhaiphong. Okay. So Rumble. Everyone go there. Make sure you're following me there. Now, just don't necessarily leave YouTube if you already view me on YouTube, because YouTube, I'm still alive here for now. But of course, Rumble is the best place for independent viewing. So if you do go on Rumble, please just support me there, and be sure to, just watch. You can watch me on both tabs. You can also, just choose to watch me on YouTube, and then, of course, hit the like button on Rumble or what have you, right? So it's all your choice. But in any event, do continue to support me on all these platforms. With that said, everybody, we are out of here, okay? I am going to let you know tomorrow if I'm going live. It all depends on whether I can muster it up. I also got an invitation by RBN to go live on their channel. So not sure I'll be able to do both, stream twice and go on shows twice in 2 days, but I will do my best to make all of this work. All right, everybody, take good care. I will see you all. I will see you all again soon. Some people say, I don't know why people use YouTube. Well, I will say this. I have not been able to gain the same traction on Rumble. It takes a long time for a lot of people. Honestly, I do have my criticisms of the Rumble. This is nothing against the Rumble community and the people who watch Rumble, but I will say that it is harder for someone like me to gain traction on Rumble. After all my experiences on YouTube. So that's not a knock, but there are limitations on Rumble that I'm not a fan of. And so I'm hoping that Rumble is listening, especially with regard to who is elevated on Rumble versus who is not. All right. With that said, everybody, stay tuned. I will be back again very soon. And everyone, have a great rest of your weekend. And I will see you all again soon. Bye-bye.